So, welcome to Philosophers in the Midst of History. This has been going on since 2016 with a little break due to COVID, quarterly series. Every year we do an ancient philosopher, a medieval philosopher, an early modern, and then a later modern philosopher. And this time around, for the later modern philosopher, I picked somebody who I probably should have talked about a long time ago, since I did my dissertation on him, Maurice Blondel. I guess I just, thought other people might be more attractive or interesting, but it was fun to go back to his thought, which I've never completely left. And he's kind of you could say, an undervalued stock, right? Not a lot of people know about him. There's a lot of really interesting stuff in his work, and he lived through some very interesting times for quite a long time. He died in 1949, after the world had been through all these upheavals. And he had a massive impact even after his death. Some people have called him the philosopher of Vatican II, in part because different strains of his influence lead to the Second Vatican Council and what goes on in it. He's not that much read today, and it's in part because of something that I think I may have mentioned in previous sessions. Sometimes there's like a vicious cycle that goes on where a philosopher hasn't been translated that much, in his case from French into English. And because of that, people who are teaching or studying philosophy assume that, well, if it was important, it would have been translated, and so we're not going to pay attention to it, and that means there's less interest in producing new translations, which just kind of reinforces itself as a cycle. I have actually translated some of Blondel's work in my 2011 book, Reason Fulfilled by Revelation, the 1930s Christian Philosophy Debates in France. There were 4 pieces that I translated for that. I wanted to translate 5, but actually the Société d'études philosophiques wouldn't allow me to publish one of them. There's a little story there that we can talk about later on. His most well-known book is Action 1893. This is the Oliva Blanchette translation. And I actually had a correspondence with Oliva Blanchette and asked him why he translated this, given that there was already a translation out there. And he was at Boston College for a very long time. He died just recently. And he said, well, the previous translation, I was using it to teach in class, and it was so bad I kept on having to correct it to my students. And so I thought, well, what the hell? I'll just translate it myself. And you can tell, this is kind of a tome, right? It's not a short little work. I mentioned that I wrote my dissertation on Blondell. So I'm going to tell a little bit of personal story before we jump into talking about him, just because it might be of some interest. So I didn't have any intention of studying this guy originally, and I haven't even heard of him, but I was going to satisfy a requirement for my graduate studies of translating a work from French. And you could either take a translation class, just for like non-specialists, or you could take a test where they would throw something at you and have you translate it, or you could translate an article on your own. And so my mentor at the time was a guy who kind of specialized in Holocaust studies. So I was, I found a piece that was kind of recent from French about something having to do with the Holocaust, and I was like, hey, how about I do this? And he poked his head into my office, and he was like, don't bother with that crap, Why don't you translate something that needs translating? Somebody who's been ignored and neglected, Maurice Blondel, for instance. And I thought, oh, okay, I better go and check this guy out. So I went to the library. Fortunately, at that time, Southern Illinois University, for a sort of second-tier state school, had an amazing research library. They had all of Blondel's stuff available there in French. And I got this I got this volume, the Les Premiers Écrits, the first writings of Maurice Blondel, right? And I started reading through it, and I was like, oh, this is pretty cool stuff. I should translate this. And then this is, there's a moral to this story. I started translating it. So I'd sit at my computer, and I'd have the book in front of me, and I'd puzzle over how to translate this or translate that, and I got like 100 pages done. And then I found out that somebody else had already translated those writings, and they didn't need to be translated. And I knew that some had been translated already, namely the ones that wound up in this volume, The Letter on Apologetics in History and Dogma. But I was translating The Idealist Illusion and An Elementary Logic of the Moral Life. Turns out this Irish philosopher, Fiacre Long, had already brought out a book, and I just didn't know about it. So, all that effort kind of wasted. But it got me really interested in Blondell. And I kept reading him, kept, thinking about him. I did an independent study with my mentor, for which, by the way, he never gave me a grade. It's a good thing that I took extra classes in graduate school, because otherwise I would have been, in some trouble. He assigned me an incomplete and then never assigned a grade, and then he retired, and that was that. So long story short, I'm into Blondell. I'm also very much into Hegel, somebody who we've talked about before in the past. And I was going to write my dissertation on the two different philosophers and do like a compare contrast. How do you get from this guy to this guy? Blondell is often called the Catholic Hegel, the French Hegel, because they've got a lot of similarities in the way that they approach things. And my committee, what happens when you're going to write a dissertation, first you do a lot of other stuff. You pass these tests or things like that. Then you write a prospectus. And then in the prospectus you're saying, it's like a big promissory note. I'm going to do this, 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 and this. And then the committee gets together and they're like, well, we don't want you to do this. We want you to do this instead. And they're in charge, so you kind of got to go with what they say. And their ruling was, we think that's too much for you to tackle. Writing about Hegel is already tough. You seem really into Blondell. Why don't you just write your dissertation on Blondell, And there was like no attention at all to like, would this help me get a job or something? And I actually did have a guy later on down the line at a place that I was working. He said, nobody's ever going to hire you to teach Blondell, Career-wise, it wasn't the greatest move, but I really enjoyed it. And so I ended up drawing on his untranslated French works and writing this big, sprawling 350-page dissertation that I've never published, just cannibalized bits and pieces of, that's now actually in an ancient format, WordPerfect, some of you may remember that. And I could convert it to Word possibly, but there's all these, French diacritics, right, in it, and all those codes will get screwed up. So I've never bothered with that. And I just kind of moved on. But I had this British pal of mine who said, you should do some translation of Blondell. And I was like, well, I already tried that, And he said, no, there's other things that you should translate instead. The stuff from the Christian philosophy debates in the 1930s. And so, he sent me some of the photocopies of that, and I started digging into that. And this is a whole different topic. I eventually realized that the English literature, the English language literature on the debates had shrunk it down to this tiny little thing, but it was actually a massive set of debates that involved about 50 different people from 1931 to 1936. And so I decided to translate some of them, and there's a lot of other people in this book as well as a long historical introduction and index and stuff like that. So it's not all translation, but I thought, Blondell could use, getting out there. Unfortunately, this book, which was intended to be like get people into the study of stuff, Catholic University of America Press priced it too high. So libraries bought it, a few scholars bought it, not too many other people bought it. If you price a book above $50, generally nobody's going to buy it. So, that's that. So that's enough like personal stuff. Blondell, you've got this lengthy timeline that I created with what's going on in his life and then what was happening largely in France or French matters. And you notice he lived a long, long time, born in 1861. So, you know, what's going on around that time? He's born before the First Vatican Council. He's born shortly before France is going to engage in some more adventurism, invading Mexico, for example. And he's born in Dijon. He is not somebody from the Paris, you could say, intelligentsia or elite or anything like that. He's from the provinces. He's not an ordinary guy. He's from a bourgeois family. But these, you know, in France, even all the way up to today, things are very, very centralized, with Paris being like the center of the universe. I remember one time, I won't say which famous philosopher this was, but I was having lunch because he came down to our school, and I asked him mistakenly, "Oh, where in France are you from?" And he looked at me like I was an idiot. And he said, "Paris, where else?" You know, like everything important happens in Paris. So he's born out in the provinces, and he's born in a tumultuous time. And his family sends him to religious primary school, and that was at that time a political move, because the French Third Republic was very, very anti-clerical, very anti-Catholic. That was seen as like a black mark against him as a kid. He learns to read and write rather reluctantly. he's not super into that sort of stuff. And then he enters this secular lyceum in Dijon, and he starts getting a classical education. He learns Greek and Latin. He learns some German. Doesn't really learn English. That wasn't considered a high priority at the time, the way it would be in the present. And, you know, all sorts of other things, history, some science, mathematics, and all of that. By that time, we see that the Franco-Prussian War has happened. And this is a massive upheaval, right? Because before that, the French were kind of the butt kickers. Right? You had Napoleon, and it took like everybody lining up against him to bring him down. And, you know, they try to shave France down a bit, but France is still a massively strong country. So for the Prussians to come in, after they've already, like, you know, defeated Denmark and Austria and just like knock the crap out of the French in a big surprise, it was kind of a shock. It led to the dissolution of the government. Napoleon III, it's the end of the Second Empire and the end of his reign. The Paris Commune forms and then is repressed by the army. And so there's a lot going on, particularly in Paris. Meanwhile, you know, Blondell is going along with his life, you know, 13 years old, he makes his first communion. He actually, at that time, there was like a tradition for making your first communion that you would pick a brother, somebody who you're going to be connected with. And he chooses a chimney sweep, this kid who's already working and dirty as hell, you know. His name is Augustin, and he chooses him as his brother. His family's conflicted about that, but, you know, he's proceeding along this kind of a life where he's taking religion quite seriously. He gets a Bachelor of Letters in Rhetoric from the Lyceum Dijon, and then earns a Bachelor of Letters in Philosophy. And then he starts as a good, dutiful, you know, not quite boy anymore, but young adult. He's going to study law, like his parents want him to. And he gets drawn off into philosophy, which is his true love. And then he makes a really interesting, fateful decision. He considers the possibility of a priestly vocation. And there's letters about just about everything with this guy, because he wrote tons and tons of letters that were actually preserved. And there's some reflections on his part about why he didn't become a priest. He decided, instead of becoming a priest, he thought that he could follow what he called a lay apostolate, meaning doing, a vocation within the world. and he would do so in philosophy. And, with the current stature of philosophy, you might say, well, why did he pick something that nobody pays attention to anymore? Well, at that time, they did pay attention to philosophy. It still had a lot more cultural cachet, and it was viewed as like this capstone of the sciences and very important for a number of different reasons. And he thinks, I'm going to go to the École Normale in Paris, and I'm going to study with the best secular minds there are, and I'm going to bring Christianity and philosophy into some sort of fruitful contact with each other. And that's really the story of his entire career. And I'm going to do so in a way that'll be faithful to Christianity, but it will also be faithful to philosophy. There won't be any we're going to take Christianity and shove it down the philosophers' throats and superimpose it on that. There's not going to be any rationalization of Christianity where we say, well, the philosophy says this, so much the worse for Christianity. It's going to be dialectical. They're going to both communicate with each other, and they're going to do so through my studies, through my mind and my engagements. And so he goes there and he studies with this guy, Léon Olé-Leprun and Émile Boutreau, both of his professors who are kind of sympathetic to what he's doing, because a lot of professors do not like what he's doing at all. They view him as smuggling Christianity and even worse, Catholicism into philosophical studies where it's got no place whatsoever. And he meets this guy, Victor Delbo, who he becomes very good friends with, who's a historian of philosophy. Blondell fails the first couple times that he takes the agrégation. That is a sort of a set of essay tests that you need to take if you want to be authorized to teach. And not just teach in the university, but even in the junior colleges and stuff like that. So he fails the first couple times, and he keeps coming back. He does teach as a substitute for a little while at this lycée in Chaumont, and then finally passes his aggregation examinations. And then he's appointed professor of philosophy. Now, that sounds very nice, being professor of philosophy, but that was a sort of title that would vary depending on where you were teaching. So it's not like being professor of philosophy at the Sorbonne or being professor of philosophy at the École Normale. He is teaching at another lycée in Aix, en Provence. And, it's not a bad gig for him. He has to overcome a bit of shyness with the students. As a matter of fact, there's a really great story that's told about him. He was very young looking, right? And so they know that they're getting a new teacher, new professor. And he's out there BSing around with the kids, with the boys, and young men, really. And they're all whoa, I wonder who this guy is, and what is he going to be like? Is he a jerk? Is he a cool guy? And then they're all shuffling into class, and then he walks up to the front, and he's like, all right, let's start studying philosophy. And they're like, holy crap, it's this guy that we were playing soccer with just a couple minutes ago and shooting the breeze with. Good thing we didn't say anything, bad about him or anything like that. And, he winds up, at that point in time, he's got to start working on his dissertation. In France at that time, you actually wrote 2 dissertations. You wrote one dissertation in French, and that'll become this, L'Action 1893, translated into English. I should mention, too, why do I have 2 copies? So when I defended my dissertation, my co-chair, because my mentor by then had retired, so he could only be co-chair, the other one, who is still working there, who's still down there in Southern Illinois, came up to me and he's like, got a present for you, here you go. So he had a copy laying around. And so I was like, oh, that's really awesome. Now I finally got a copy for myself. I don't have to use the library one. But so he's working on Action, 1893, and he also wrote a Latin dissertation on Leibniz. So, the Latin one goes along swimmingly, not a problem. Everybody's like, yeah, this is really great work. It's on what he calls the vinculum substantiale, the substantial link. between various different things. The Latin title, if you want to know, is De Vinculo Substantii e de Substantia Composita Apud Leibnizium. Very nice little thing. Not too many people read it. I've never read it myself. Doesn't appear to have made a big splash or anything like that. Actio 1883 was probably one of the most controversial dissertations published in that era, in part because what he's doing, to begin with, I'll say just a few things. So one of the things that he's doing, it's called Actio 1883, so he's focusing on action, the category of action, human action, praxis, right? And he's focusing very heavily on an analysis of how the will works, and it's dialectical. So it starts at the lowest levels and then builds up, and everything is in this very complex, you could call it system that he's elaborating. And it has to be not a rigid system, but one that's flexible enough to extend to human affairs. So it's very much like Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit, which is much harder to read because Blondell is not the greatest writer, but he's a lot more clear than Hegel is. In the fifth part of action, there is this entire discussion of religion. Blondell thought that you cannot avoid what at the time was called the religious problem. Namely, as we're moving into from the Enlightenment into the 19th century, an era of science and positivism, and all sorts of problems within the church and things like that, and we're moving into the new century. Is all this religious stuff just kind of BS or a waste of time? Is it something we are going to leave behind as human beings? Should we get rid of the idea of the supernatural? What's going on there? That's happening on the secular side, right? And philosophy is mostly there. The Catholic Church is also going through an intellectual renaissance at that time. Aeterni Patris is published in 1879 by Leo XIII, which is a calling for a revival of the study of St. Thomas and of scholastic writers. That leads to new institutions being formed, like Louvain in Belgium, all sorts of houses of studies all over the place. And there's conflict between secular philosophers and, in France, largely Catholic philosophers. There were a few Reformed Protestants as well. And things like this are happening in Germany, and they're happening in Italy, and they're happening in a different way in England. Leo XIII is also going to publish another massively important encyclical during his lifetime called the Rerum Novarum on New Things. This is a articulation of Catholic social theory, sort of in the face of all these different movements that are going on, thinking about labor, capitalism. It's arguing for giving the just wages. It says that you can have trade unions and things like that. It's also like arguing against communism and socialism, and it's articulating a whole new way of seeing things. So there's a lot going on within Catholic intellectual life. And Blondell is sort of like riding this crest. So the question is, where does he belong? Does he belong in the secular academy? Well, when you get to part 5 of this book, and he's telling you that there's the one thing necessary, and that's God. There's actually a chapter title, The One Thing Necessary, right? And that everybody has to make an option. They have to decide between one way of orienting their life or another. So his dissertation defense went on for hours. And, if you've ever been in a dissertation defense, it's kind of a scary situation, right? Did you do a dissertation defense? So, one of the things that happens, I don't know if this happened to you, but you can have prepared as much as you like. And then they say, okay, we've heard your thing, you've defended your thing. Now would you please leave the room? And so you go out and you're in the hallway and they're conferring. And, they might keep you out there for half an hour or something. And then they bring you back in. And usually they're like, congratulations, Dr. So-and-so, but you don't know, right? And in Blondell's case, a lot of the people were really ready to argue. They're like, this is great up to chapter 4, part 4. We don't like this other stuff. And, eventually he's passed. But you can tell that it leaves a stain because they won't give him a job. In France, at the time, there was a minister of education, and then, all these bureaucrats under him. And Blondell was denied a teaching position because it was viewed that he was suspect. He'd smuggled in religion by the back door. Now, shortly after he defends his dissertation, 2 really important things happen. One personal for Blondell, one for France itself. He meets Rose, Royer, meets her, falls in love with her. She falls in love with him. They're married within months. She will be his only wife in the course of his life. Unfortunately, she will die kind of young compared to him, but they have a really wonderful life together. At the same time, the Dreyfus affair is happening. So, we often learn about this like in history books. Oh, the Dreyfus affair in France. This was something that factionalized France just as much as any recent event that we can think of. You think of the rise of the Tea Party and the Trump presidency and the polarization involved in that. The Dreyfus affair was like that. Different institutions are lining up for and against Dreyfus. Dreyfus was a Jewish French military officer, gets accused of being a spy. He's not actually the spy. It turns out they figure out who the real spy is a couple years later. He gets sent to prison. And then, Zola writes this j'accuse, saying basically, look at this kangaroo court nonsense that's going on. And it brings a whole bunch of people in on all sides of French society. And it's going to lead, ultimately, not just to these fractures, but to the rise of what will ultimately be fascism in France. There is a proto-fascist organization that gets started called Action Française, and they're going to be one of the main enemies of everybody on the left and even people who are kind of in the middle, like Blondell. It's associated, at first with these 2 guys, Maurice Pujol and Henri Vaugeois, but then you get this guy, Charles Marat. And Marat is a writer. He's an atheist who thinks that Catholicism could be a really useful tool. He's against, anybody on the left. He's also against Jews. He's also against migrant workers. They were called the Métis at that time in France. And they've got a newspaper. They've got a youth group, the Camelot de Roi. They form what are arguably the first stormtroopers, and they start beating the crap out of people. And they're on a broad front. And a lot of Catholic intellectuals lined up with Marat. One of them, who eventually left after Action Française was finally condemned, was Jacques Maritain, who was, a leading Catholic thinker at the time. Blondell himself is getting involved in all of this ferment. And one thing that you can say about Blondell, there's a lot more that could be said about this, but here's a generalization you can kind of take to the bank. Blondell would see what was going on with 2 or more sides that were being very polemical with each other and often like losing the thread of truth. And he'd say, all right, we're not going to be like a centrist and just split the difference, all sidesism or any of that sort of nonsense. We're going to be really rigorous, and we're going to do philosophy here. We're going to see who's full of crap and who's not. And we're going to apply some rigorous methods to critique this side and to critique this side. And we're going to try to take what's true in them and come up with a better synthesis. Now, when you do that, everybody hates you, right? That's almost inevitable. I found this out the hard way when Facebook was first becoming a thing. I was teaching critical thinking classes, and I'd have friends on right and left, from high school, and people would say, crazy stuff, and then I'd be like, well, that's not actually true. And then they'd be like, you belong to that side. We hate your guts, And then the same people would do that on the other side, right? So Blondell is going to catch it from everybody. And I'm going to simplify a little bit. Some of the back and forth arguments had to do with what was called modernism. And modernism is identified as a heresy by the Catholic Church, a belief that religion needs to be adapted to modern times in such a way that it would lose a lot of what's really central to it, right? And this was associated with the higher criticism and biblical studies, which not only applied to the Bible, but also to stories about saints. The Catholics were kind of at a real disadvantage when it came to the higher criticism. And then, so you got the modernists on one side, and there were actual modernists. Blondell was friends with some of them. They were religion needs to totally reshape itself, or else it's not worth anything. And then there were the people that Blondell called the Vetterists. He also calls them extrinsicists. One word that he does use that we now see coming on the fore, integralists. There's a rise in religious circles here in the United States and elsewhere of integralism, which says basically the same sort of stuff that Action Française was saying back in the early 1900s and all the way to the 20s until they got condemned by the Vatican for going too far. So Blondell is trying to say that, listen, we can't just jump right down this sort of modernist, everything's great because it's modern, get rid of all the old crap kind of approach. But we also can't be these stick in the mud, everything was great under, St. Thomas Aquinas, the old church is the best thing. We can't reject modernity. If Christianity is going to survive as something other than, a weird aberration of itself, it's got to adapt. It's got to rethink new situations. And that's what he saw, Leo XIII doing. Some popes are more conservative. Pius X was the one who condemned modernism in his Pascendi thing and in the Lamentabili. Pius X also, interestingly enough, because people started gunning for Maurice Blondel, Pius X actually gave Blondel, you could say, a shield. He told one of the most rabid of the anti-modernists, I assert that Blondel is orthodox, and you're not to go after him anymore. Now, that didn't keep some of the Catholic figures from going after him. But so you've got all this stuff going on, right? You've got a lot of different moving parts here, and Blondel continually trying to thread this needle, I don't want to be a modernist. I also don't want to be a Vetterist. I want to find something better than that. When it comes to social life, I don't want to be with the people who they weren't identified yet as fascists, but they're on the way to being fascists, Action Française and their ilk, the anti-Dreyfusards. But I also don't want to just give in to the forces on the left either. I want to think this stuff through. I want to think about what a just society would look like, what working people ought to have, how these things ought to be understood, how old doctrines can be brought into the modern age to make sense of this. So he gets involved with the Semaine Sociale, the Social Week movement, which brings in all these great experts for an entire week. He actually gives a course. One of the things that I did translate, and I may go back to it and fix it, is a piece called Patrie et Humanité. And I think it's really, really timely. So patria, homeland. We would translate this as homeland and humanity. Blondel saw the writing on the wall about nationalism and fascism and these movements that were particularly, again, associated with Action Française in France. By the way, Steve Bannon, when he came on the scene, I was like, this guy is just Charles Maurras, Redux. He's not really doing anything new. This is very identifiable as what Blondel was attacking. So he's talking about what a just social order would look like and what it would have to require and how we would move forward. So that's a lot of what's going on in the 1900s for Blondell. There's a couple other things. I mean, his wife, his mother both die in the same year, which really sucks, leaving him with 3 kids, one of whom is a teenager. In the 1920s, his sight is actually going to get really bad. By 1927, he's effectively working by dictation, and he doesn't actually have a secretary for a while who can put together all of the documents that he's got and all that. It's amazing the work that he did, given that he was nearly blind for, it would be about the last 2 decades of his life. In the 1930s, again, I'm hawking my book again, right? So in the 1930s, there are these debates that are taking place about Christian philosophy, and they're kicked off by the 1930 things that are being published, because 1930 is the 1500-year centenary of the death of St. Augustine. So Blondell writes a couple pieces, one of which is actually just called, I'll translate from the French, the 1500-year anniversary of the death of St. Augustine. He also wrote another piece called the Forever or Endlessly Renewed Fertility of Augustinian Thought. He also writes another one, The Latent Resources of Augustinian Thought. And a lot of people are talking about Augustine as being a Christian philosopher. And so people are like, well, what the hell does that actually mean? Right? What is Christian philosophy? Some people, so I've given you this handout here. It starts these debates going on, right, in French-speaking areas. And some people are like, there is no such thing as Christian philosophy. That's an oxymoron. If it's philosophy, it can't have any sort of religious commitment. If it's Christianity, it's not philosophical. So there are these people called the rationalists, like Émile Brehier, a young, sort of becoming very famous historian of philosophy. Leon Brunschwig, who was on Blondell's dissertation committee. He also thinks that this is a mistaken idea. You also have some people from the religious point of view who are like, don't mix that philosophy crap in with Christianity. You're going to mess it up. Karl Barth would be an example of that later on in Germany. Leon Shestov, he's an example of that. And then you've got some of the neo-scholastics or neo-Thomists who are also saying this is a bad idea, right? But there are some other people, mostly within Catholic but also Reformed Protestant circles, who are like, no, there's something to this. We need to figure out what Christian philosophy would look like. And the most interesting feature of these debates is the rationalists were dealt with really easily. By the first couple of years, they're like knocked out of the debate. The neo-scholastics, not paid that much attention to. The real battle is between Catholic philosophers who think that there is Christian philosophy, but how should you conceptualize this? And they don't agree. And weirdly enough, Blondell, Étienne Gilson, and Jacques Maritain are like the 3 most important members, Gabriel Marcel to a lesser extent. And Gilson and Maritain, they line up against Blondell, and Blondell lines up against them, and a lot of other people take stands. And they all behave towards each other as Catholic intellectuals who are all decent people with an incredible lack of charity towards each other. Like they're all misunderstanding each other and fighting back and forth. Blondell, actually, they all bring out books. Gilson has a whole bunch of different books, like The Spirit of Medieval Philosophy. Blondell has this book that he brings out, the Le Problème de la Philosophie Catholique in 1932. My version's not in great shape, so I won't pass it around. You notice there's tape holding it together and stuff. Maritain brings out a book, an essay on Christian philosophy. And then there's these other people, and you notice some of them being listed there: Antonin Sertiange, Henri de Lubac, Bruno de Solage, that are like, listen, guys, you're actually all on the same page. You're just talking past each other. Why can't you actually get along on this matter? And none of them actually pay attention to that. So there's an incredible range of positions. And this is something, it's a controversy that from like 1931 to about 1935, 1936 is just captivating the French philosophical scene, particularly if you have any religious bent. And it brings in a whole bunch of people. And then, why does it peter out? Everybody's getting ready for war. World War II is going to happen soon. And Blondell is also moving on. He is going to produce a metaphysical trilogy, it's called. And it's actually 5 volumes, because the first book and the last book are each 2 volumes. So the first book is called Le Pensée, Thought, right? And it's this incredibly detailed study of what goes into human thinking, and he brings in this idea of cosmic thought. The second one is L'être et les êtres, being with a capital B and beings, right? And then Action is the third one, 2 volumes again, and it's a redoing of Action 1893, like from the ground up. So he's working on that, and he's working on all sorts of other things at the time as well. I'll just mention a few of them. As the war goes on, and eventually, France is occupied, and then the Allies liberate France. And World War II ends in 1945, Blondell has brought out a number of different works, including, I'll just translate it's in French, Lutte pour la civilisation et philosophie de la paix, Battle for Civilization and a Philosophy of Peace. Untranslated at this time, hard to get your hands on too. By the very end of his life, he's written a few other things about social matters, but he's also discussing existentialism, which is now coming on the scene. He is discussing some of the criticisms that have been made of him. But then there's this condition de la pacification mondiale, meaning the conditions that would be required for bringing about a worldwide pacification, a peace, a bringing about peace. This is, he views this as quite important. I mentioned that he would have significant influence that would lead to Vatican II. Vatican II is happening in the 60s, right? Blondell is long dead by then. So how does this guy wind up influencing Vatican II to the point that people would call him the philosopher of Vatican II? Well, he influences 2 really important strains of thought. One is within the Thomist tradition. Blondell had influenced a lot of Thomist thinkers, even though he was not a Thomist. And I should say something about that too. So Thomism was never the official Catholic philosophy, but it may as well have been for quite a while. Even if you weren't like super attracted to Thomas Aquinas, you would find it so much easier to get your ideas listened to if you frame them in terms of Thomism. You could say from like maybe, the early 1900s all the way into the 60s. I think Vatican II kind of changed that a bit. And so you've got all these people who are using a Thomist vocabulary to do philosophy, and they're doing it in very different ways from each other. You've got like Thomists who think that Blondell is basically in league with the devil, like Garrigou-Lagrange, who even today people rely upon quite a bit. When somebody says, oh yeah, I'm into Garrigou-Lagrange, I know they're like an ultra-conservative Catholic, perhaps not even in the church anymore because they buy into like a schismatic thing. Because that was Lagrange's stuff. There's other people like Henri de Lubac, who was a good friend of Maurice Blondel, very heavily influenced by him. Antonin Sertillanges, who unfortunately hasn't been translated very much because his works are really quite wonderful. He had a guy who was originally an opponent of him who comes around to thinking that Blondel is a very important thinker, Pierre Rousselot. Yves Conjar, who's an important person for the Vatican Council. Even people like Americans, like Norris Clark, are influenced by Maurice Blondel to some degree. So there are these Thomists that are interested in Blondel, and some of them are what we call transcendental Thomists. This gets kicked off with a guy, Joseph Marchal, who is a Jesuit who actually never gets to teach anything above college. But he writes all these great works, and he was really into Blondel. And then he leads to Karl Rahner, and then after them comes Bernard Lonergan, and all of these people are trying to do kind of what Blondel is doing. We need to bring theology and Christian philosophy into the present. We can't just pretend like Immanuel Kant doesn't matter, or pick whoever else you want. The way in which we show that Christianity can adapt is we take on the strongest, the hardest thought, and we engage with it fully. And that's what the Transcendental Thomists are doing. There's also this movement called the Nouvelle Théologie, New Theology, and Henri de Lubac would be a great example of that. That's heavily influenced by Maurice Blondel, among some other thinkers like Charles Péguy, who unfortunately dies in World War I, and some others as well. And then you could also say, there's a third thing that's not affecting Vatican II quite so much, but it's going to play a role later on, and that is the phenomenological movement. What Blondel is doing is not in phenomenology, but it's very similar to it. Instead of calling his work phenomenology, he calls it first the method of immanence, and then he calls it the method of implication. But it's quite similar, and Blondel paved the way for phenomenology to come into France. He also got read by people like Karol Wojtyła in the Lublin Thomists. Karol Wojtyła would become John Paul II. John Paul II would write a encyclical. While I was in graduate school, we all read it and discussed it, called Fides et Ratio, Faith and Reason. And if you read that document, you're going to see like a whole laundry list of like philosophers that we ought to be looking at, some of whom are Thomists, some of whom aren't, like Dietrich von Hildenbrand or Gabriel Marcel. And as I think it was Fiacre Long pointed out, you're not going to see Blondel's name in the document because the whole document could be by Blondel. That entire, this is the definitive Catholic take on what faith and reason should look like going into the new millennium is thoroughly Blondelian. Because John Paul II knew Blondel's work and was clearly influenced by it in his approaches. So, Blondel continues to exercise some interesting behind-the-scenes significance, but not a lot of people are reading him these days. There is a Blondel Archives in Louvain-la-Neuve, and they put on conferences every once in a while. But if we look at who's doing the conferences, it's all like the same old scholars. It's not a great sign for longevity of Blondel studies when you don't have a ton of young people studying it, right? You need new blood. But you could have a revival. People like me could come along and be told by their mentors, you should read this guy, and then start reading him, and then be like, holy crap, this stuff is really quite extraordinary. Who knows? We don't really know what's going to happen. I might translate some Blondel stuff. There's a few other people interested in it, but translation is a lot of work, So I don't know if I want to do the work or not. But he's a very interesting guy. Part of the theme of this series is how these philosophers contributed to history. Blondel contributed not just to the history of philosophy, but changes within the Catholic Church. And you could say, there's a lot of like bad changes that happen within the Catholic Church. You say Blondell's not responsible unless you're one of those like super ultra conservative Catholics, in which case Blondell you blame for everything without ever reading him. Blondell's largely responsible for a lot of good changes within the Church, and he's not really tied in with the bad changes. For example, this will be a little bit of a controversial thing. The Catholic Church is within the middle of a sexual abuse scandal that just never seems to end, right? And lots more still needs to be done in order to fix things and provide justice to those who were abused. And it led to a lot of secularization where people are like, the Church doesn't defend people, except for the bad guys. If Blondell were around, he would be super involved in criticism of that. That's the kind of person that he was. He'd probably be so involved that he'd get himself in some trouble, with some of the theologians or bishops. He certainly would be condemning Catholic integralism, which is a growing movement right now, tied in with, totalitarian conceptions around the world. I think it's a dangerous movement. Blondell was a serious critic of that. So maybe we need to bring him more back on the scene. He's certainly a polarizing figure. And that's pretty much all that I have to say about him. Usually we take a little pause in the middle for Q&A, but I thanks for bearing with me on this. But let's do some discussion or questions and answer at this point, because I don't have much more planned to say. I mean, there's tons and tons of stuff that I could say, but which things should I focus on? That's the hard thing for a guy who lived so long, wrote so much, and made so many interesting contributions. So what would you like to talk about?
Well, can you talk a little bit more about his actual methodology? I tried to read a little bit about it.
Yeah.
And how he compares to Hegel.
So I mentioned that he calls what he's doing by two different names, right? The method of immanence is basically you can think about it as give philosophies enough rope to hang themselves. Right? So if you want to really grapple with modern thought, you think it through all the way. You see what's really there, what it would be like to live a life like Descartes or Spinoza or Hegel, or pick whoever you want. What would be the total implications of their thought? You sort of another way of thinking about it is you give them complete charity, but then you're critical. And how is it like Hegel's thought? Well, Hegel thinks that one of the things that you have to do is you don't just take something for granted as what it is. You study it and see what it develops into. So, for example, when we're thinking about the choices that we make, or let's make it even bigger, like we're doing something as a society. There are always going to be oversimplifications that we're relying upon when we make decisions about let's do this thing, right? And we shouldn't just wait around and see what happens. We should think out the implications ahead of time. This would lead to this. Well, maybe we don't take this route then. Or we start seeing where the hidden contradictions and things are and seeing whether they're real contradictions, like this is an impasse. You want to believe this and believe this, but you can't believe both together. Or whether they call for us to rethink how we conceptualize this and conceptualize this. And that's essentially what the method of immanence is doing. The word immanence tended to get him in trouble, in part because some of the modernists also like that word a lot, Immanence is usually compared to transcendence, right? So instead of having some bring things in from above and impose the structures there, you look and see what's actually there. So, for example, in Axiom 1893, right, it begins, when you look at the table of contents, it begins by looking at, is there a problem of action? is there really? Well, actually, I should read this line because it's a beautiful beginning that he has. Let me get past the introduction here. He says, "Yes or no? Does human life make sense? And does man have a destiny? I act, but without even knowing what action is, without having wished to live, without knowing exactly either who I am or even if I am. This appearance of being which flutters about within me, these light and evanescent actions of a shadow, bear in them, I am told, an eternally weighty responsibility, and that, even at the price of blood, I cannot buy nothingness because it is for me no longer. Supposedly, then, I am condemned to life, condemned to death, condemned to eternity. Why? And by what right, if I did not know it and did not will it?" And he says, well, there's a problem here. And he says this problem is inevitable. We resolve it inevitably. And the solution, true or false, each one bears in his actions. This is why we must study action. So what does he do then? He actually studies, how does the will work? How do human beings make commitments and decisions? Which ones are going the right way? Which ones are going the wrong way? So again, to go like the question you asked about Hegel, Hegel's doing something kind of similar, except he's doing it, not quite 100 years before, but 80, 90 years before. And Blondell is doing it from, you could say, different vantage points. Hegel is pretty abstract compared to Blondell. Neither of them are the clearest of writers. I'll say that. But Blondell's probably clearer than Hegel, at least. But he is similar to Hegel in that you don't just do like separate analyses of each thing. You want them to like join together in something like a system that you could understand. And the other thing that where Blondell and Hegel are they're both grappling with the same thing, but they're going to take different solutions. So, when we look at philosophy throughout its history, and we get away from like contemporary analytic philosophy or some of the, what we often call continental philosophy, where the focus is much more narrow and the view is like philosophy can't do much of anything, just little bits and pieces here. Philosophy has typically been understood as like being about the whole of reality, right? We want to have a rational approach to as much as we can. So philosophy is making some big, big claims. What does religion do? Well, religion is kind of like philosophy in that, you can just like focus on, I just go to church and, say my prayers and I don't think about all these sort of things, but that's not what particular religious traditions do. They have like everything is covered, right? So they're going to come in conflict pretty soon because they're both making claims about the whole and all the different things within it. So the question is, do they have to be opposed to each other, or can they interfuse in some way, or is one subordinated to the other? Interestingly, too, before I say this thing, so Hegel, his view is, philosophy trumps religion. Religion is for, religion is representation. It's for people who aren't smart enough to get philosophy. And the way that you make religion better is you turn it into philosophy. Blondell wants to hold on to both of them. He doesn't want to throw away philosophy and say, religion will give us everything. No, philosophy has a role to play. And he sees, like in the history of Christianity, that it has played an incredibly important role. Augustine was not just a theologian, he was a philosopher. Thomas Aquinas was a philosopher, right? Pascal was a philosopher, even though they all had religious orientations. So somehow you got to get those two big, colossal, cultural, intellectual forces to not be at each other's throat all the time. And that's what Blondell is trying to do, right? But he realizes that you can't you can make a case for that, but you can't make everybody get along. The other thing I'll say too is that the stuff that Blondell is saying and the stuff that Hegel is saying about, in terms of religion and philosophy, it's not just a Christianity problem. It's also a problem for Islam. It's also a problem for Hinduism. It's also a problem for Buddhism, particularly theistic Buddhism, which is the majority worldwide of practicing Buddhists. They have some sort of beliefs about a cosmic Buddha or gods and bodhisattvas and things doing particular tasks. How do you line up a vast religious tradition with what philosophy and also what modern thought are contributing? Blondell doesn't worry about that. He's got enough to do with Christianity right? And the complicated church politics of his time, but the implications are considerably wider. I think they could apply to really any religion that wants to be plausible in our modern era, but also has these sort of like global sets of claims, upon us. I mean, I ranged kind of far from your original question, but does that help at all?
They're both kind of iterative.
Yeah, very much so.
You work on it, and you find something, but you find some problems, and you kind of got to go to another level, and then you got to work from that level, or you solve, but then you have a problem. So
that's right.
Another level.
Yeah,
and you keep going up these levels, right?
Yeah, I forget who used this metaphor, and it's being used for Hegel and for Blondell. They call it cycloidal, right? So it's not just like an endless circle. You actually do make some progress, but you don't make it in a linear fashion. You make it by slowly spiraling in and getting closer, at least you think. I mean, maybe what ends up happening is you get about to this point, and then suddenly it gets big again, and you're like, oh, got to do some more circling around, right? But you're right, yeah, both Hegel and Blondell are doing that. And it's because philosophy, as like you could call it the premier work of the human mind, and religion, this orientation towards whatever we consider to be divine, they're incredibly complicated, right? And they're mediated through other people. None of us come to philosophy. I mean, so like think about René Descartes, right? So René Descartes is going to like do philosophy from the ground up. He's got his famous stove-heated room. Now he can finally think to himself because it's winter and nobody's going to bug him. Now I'll like clear everything away and start anew, right? That's like that's an imagination. Nobody's doing that. You can imagine that you're starting from brand new, but Descartes smuggles in all this stuff, as scholars have shown, from earlier philosophy that he buys into, and he of course engages with other philosophers like Thomas Hobbes, Pierre Gassendi, who's an Epicurean, writes some of the objections, and he responds to those. So nobody's like beginning from scratch. We're always like beginning in the middle of a conversation that's been going on for a long time in philosophy. And I would say the same thing for religion, right? It's not like let's say you want to convert and join some religious group. Well, they've already got a bunch of ideas and a bunch of practices and a whole bunch of, explanations of what they're doing. And you gotta kind of work your way into it. I mean, one of the interesting things that we could ask is there anything else like that besides philosophy and religion that has that scope, right? Maybe in modernity, but Blondell doesn't seem to think so. He seems to think that those two are like the biggest cultural forces that we need to make sense out of. So, yeah. Any other questions or about this guy? Yeah.
Good to see you.
You gonna take off? All right. I'll see you later.
See you again another time. Bye-bye.
So you're what I tried to read is you kind of look at things. I'll say as they are in the real world,
mm-hmm.
and you do what you can, but then you get to the point where you find problems, or you find your problems, your obstacles.
Yeah, or contradictions.
And then the transcendence, you go to a super phenomenal, phenomenological something or other. But you go to you do a transcendence, but then it's like a loop though. So you're at a higher level, but you're still working on stuff. Well, how does Blondell, ever get you to I'll say the being with the capital B,
Oh,
because if you're constantly going through this, you're never gonna, in theory, you're never gonna get to that ultimate state.
well, I mean, you don't have to get to an ultimate state for Blondell. It's enough to like figure out where you fit in as a being that acts, that thinks, that is. And if there is like an ultimate state, I mean, for Blondell, that would be God, the supernatural, the ultimately transcendent. And you're not going to become God or fully understand God. I mean, even Thomas Aquinas doesn't think that we ever comprehend God. Even the blessed in heaven don't, according to Thomas. But that doesn't mean that you can't like distinguish different legitimately connected levels. For example, one of the tricky things in social theory, whether it's Hegel or Blondel or whoever else, is how do you recognize that society and our political community is something bigger than all of us, and it shouldn't be just subordinated to a whole bunch of individuals, and also maintain scope for like the dignity of the human person, right? That's tough to pull off because if you push more towards like the society is what matters. Eventually you get to some sort of totalitarianism, right? If you push too far over to the individualistic side, then you get like either complete chaos or some elite capturing the society, and it's not really about all individuals, it's about what's good for those individuals. And how do you recognize the fact that we are social creatures and we also are centers of plans and desires and agency that are legitimate, that's part of what he's trying to, Hegel's trying to figure that out too. Blondell's trying to figure that out. And lots of other thinkers, you could say, are also trying to figure out that puzzle. And that could be like a strata within the system that you're working out, I mean, it winds up having so many moving parts that I don't know you could even like graphically represent it, whether it's Hegel or Blondel. I tried to take Hegel's phenomenology and I took like some big paper from when I was working with oil pastels. So I had this giant like reams of paper. And I used really, really small writing. I tried to map out for myself all the different things going on in Hegel's phenomenology. And I still have it somewhere in a box. What's that? Yeah, I mean, the main reason why I did that was because I was told I had to take a special thinker exam, right? And this is when I was working on my dissertation. So I took Hegel as my special thinker, and I asked the guy who was in charge, what should I study? And he said, just memorize all the dialectics and the phenomenology, and then read a little bit of the science of logic. And I was like, how the hell do you do that, And so I was like, well, I've got to put it into graphic form of some sort. But what I did was very schematic, It doesn't adequately capture the thought involved in that. It's just a representation, right, to use Hegel's term. And I think you could do a similar thing with Axion 1993 or nobody's done that with the Metaphysical Trilogy, these 5 volumes that are like 2,000 pages that are still in French, I don't know how you would do that. There are a lot of moving parts, and the trick is to see how these parts kind of fit into each other. Then again, think about Legos. People get kits that are like 10,000 pieces, and they put them together, So, maybe we could do that with Legos. Maybe we could do that with thought. I don't know. But it would be quite a challenge. I mean, we're much better when we're like focused on a problem, right, than all of the problems at once. And this is a bit of a side note, but sometimes when we're looking at these very systematic thinkers, and it could be Blondell or Hegel, or it could be Schopenhauer's World as Will and Representation, or Immanuel Kant's Critique of Pure Reason, or any very or Sartre's Being and Nothingness, any very complicated philosophical work, we're reading it and we sometimes get dismayed because we're like, holy crap, is this complicated? How the hell did they think these thoughts, right? And we're comparing where we are at this moment in time to what took years to produce. Blondell didn't think all these thoughts at one time or even in 1 week. He thought them over a long period, and then he joined them together, right? So when we're looking at a systematic work of philosophy, or I think this could even apply to, like, you think about a great novel, right? A great novel is not written in 1 week. All this stuff required a whole bunch of thinking and work and bringing it together. And it may not even be the case that Blondell ever in his life had all the thoughts that he articulated here, like, arranged in his mind, any more than Hegel with the phenomenology of spirit, right? I don't know what to make of, I don't know what to do with that thought, but I think it could be helpful for people who feel dismayed because things are, read a really great work and you're like, I'd never be able to write something like that or think something like that. Well, you don't have to, because they didn't either. They just stuck with it longer. And we're lucky that life didn't screw them up so that they couldn't follow us. Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's easier to do stuff like this when you're in graduate school or you've got a nice teaching position somewhere. Than if you're working 2 jobs. And Sartre, just to go back to him, he would walk around with the equivalent of $1,000 in his pocket. He was not hurting for anything. He was from a bourgeois family. He was okay. He could work on being in nothingness all he wanted. So it's somebody who'd be a contrast, that would be like Franz Kafka, who is working in an insurance company and writing his writings at night by himself, right, as like a sideline. So, any other questions? Well, thanks so much for your attention, and I hope you check out Blondell sometime. He's a worthwhile author. I don't know who we're doing yet next year. What we usually do is February, May, August, November, first Wednesday of the month, unless there's some sort of conflict. And so I have to think about who I want to do for ancient that I haven't done already. Then medieval. I think we'll probably do Bonaventure for medieval because we were supposed to do him, but then I had COVID. That's right. I had COVID in May, so I couldn't come here to give the talk. And then there's plenty of modern thinkers for us to figure out. So I guess I just have to figure out who the ancient thinker is going to be for next time, because I've already done Plato, Aristotle, Cicero, Plutarch, Epictetus, Epicurus, I think I did. So maybe Seneca, maybe somebody else. So, but thanks so much for coming, and hopefully I'll see you next time.